this edition of World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley, Ph.D., speaking to you from the nation's capital. And it is the afternoon of Friday, January 4th. And we are here now in the early days of the 116th Congress. We are watching now the first steps of the new Democratic majority. And, obviously, this is better than having the dictatorship of Trump, right? The autocracy of Don the Con is no way to live. This is obviously better, and in some ways it is safer. But, of course, in terms of the really critical issue of public safety, we are not much better off, precisely because the nuclear launch codes are still under the control of a mentally unstable individual. And I would like to point this out right off the bat, because when we hear people like Pelosi and Nadler and others, whether they mean well or ill, they seem to be having trouble grasping this question of the nuclear launch codes and the ability to launch thermonuclear war, and that the individual now possessing these powers, that is, individual one, Don the Con, and so forth, is mentally unfit to carry out that function. So there was a time when, it's now a cliche, right, when it was possible to say, well, there are these other serious, intelligent people, at least to some degree around him, that will restrain him. We were always thinking of that wonderful time, terrible time really, in Watergate, when James Rodney Schlesinger at the Pentagon and Henry Kissinger at the State Department combined to essentially checkmate Nixon, right, telling all their combat commanders, if you get orders, don't do anything unless you've checked with those two guys that I just mentioned. And we have examples of how Schlesinger, Kissinger, and even Defense Secretary Melvin Laird, he had been a congressman from Wisconsin, and he was the first Pentagon chief for Nixon. He also carried out various kinds of holding operations. So when it comes to these issues of Syria and, of course, Afghanistan, and then beyond that, South Korea, there might even be more. There might be Germany, my God. There might be Italy. There might be U.S. facilities in Great Britain. You don't know where the insanity is going to stop until it finds legal authorities to check it. So this is still a parlous situation. It is a time of grave danger. But we're fundamentally optimistic because, once again, the unlimited caprice of Trump is to some degree over. It's no longer like that. And, it's not so much in foreign policy, but certainly in domestic, economic, and similar things. We now have some ability of the Democrats to provide this counterweight, but we want them to get busy. It's time to get to work. It's time to investigate. It's time to essentially pin down the White House officials, get them under siege. You're not really harassing them so much. Well, you can look at it that way too. Harass them. Do whatever it takes to immobilize them, to stop them from doing evil, to stop them from causing irreparable, grievous damage to the public interest of the United States. Because as any fool can see, although there are many fools who don't see it, this is a regime being run for the benefit, and not even the benefit, the immediate moment-to-moment psychological satisfaction of the individual one and his clique. So we are beginning now this new Congress, and we'll be following this, of course. But now we are in the midst of this government shutdown. We're now in the 14th day of the shutdown. It'll be the 15th day by Saturday when you hear this. So Saturday the 5th started on December 22nd, I believe. And there is no relief in sight. And we'll have to begin to see the staying power, the holding power of Trump, his empire over his minions. In other words, the people that have been supporting Trump up to now. The great issue of the time is now their breaking point. When do they decide that this has gone too far and that their personal interests are being grievously damaged by Trump's activities? So today this was put into fairly succinct form when Trump, in a meeting with Schumer, with Pelosi, with Steny Hoyer, and with Senator Durbin of Illinois, when Trump said that he was prepared to continue the current government shutdown for a months, or even a year. A year would take us into the presidential election year of 2020. It would mean that the 1/4 of the federal government would stay shut until, all of 2019. So Trump says 1 year and the workers be damned. There were 2 events. Let's distinguish these. First was a press conference availability by the Democrats that we just mentioned, Pelosi, Schumer, Steny, Durbin, and they're at the White House after an acrimonious 2-hour meeting, right, a clash. As Pelosi said, smiling, it was a contentious meeting talking with Trump. Very little got decided, and the only benefit she could see was that she now has a better understanding of where Trump is coming from. Because, of course, the press is always prating about compromise and bipartisanship and all of this foolishness, which simply does not apply. It would be like saying to somebody in Germany in 1931 or 32, right? Yeah, there's that extreme right-wing party, because Hitler was not a leftist. He was extreme rightist, and all of his alliances were with extreme rightists, and his whole rhetoric was anti-communism and racism and, well, fascism. If somebody had said in that time, yeah, you need to compromise, right? This is very bad advice. Right now, it's clear the Republican Party doesn't need to be reformed. It needs to be removed. It needs to disappear. It needs to become extinct. This is, of course, the great lesson, the overarching lesson. Let's try to put this first at the beginning of our considerations. The Republican Party is proving day by day, week by week, that they are totally dysfunctional and should not exist. They have moral, legal, political, economic, or any other right to exist. There's no reason for them. They should go the way of the Whigs, Federalists, and the Know-Nothings, and we will go the way of coming back in just a minute here on World Radio. And we invite you to keep up with this program starting every Saturday afternoon, of course. And, however, there's also a program Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday that is called The American System. To become a part of The American System, to join the podcast, please proceed to AmericanSystem.tv, AmericanSystem.tv, and there you will find the portal that takes you into this world of knowing what is going on, knowing why it's going on, and knowing what to do about it, because the moment of action, of activism, is always present and always prominent. So that's our approach, right? This is not contemplation. This is activism. This is not just commentary. It is intervention. Change it for the better. So, AmericanSystem.tv, join the podcast. So once again, we've got the government shutdown. The main thing to draw from this is the Republican Party needs to be destroyed. It needs to be cut off from its donors. It needs to collapse. It needs to break apart into squabbling factions, whatever you want. That would then be the introduction to a party realignment. Quite a few of the Democratic leaders that you're seeing would tend to stay with the Wall Street Democrats. But there would then, we hope, be also a New Deal Democratic faction, pro-labor, pro-economic development, anti-austerity, basically the values that you hear on these broadcasts. That is what the country needs. And people like Schumer and Pelosi, I think, would tend to fall on the Wall Street Democrat side. But, of course, they can't act that out even if they wanted to now, because they have this militant faction in the House of Representatives. And there again, you got a lot of militants of ID politics, right? Identity politics is present, yes. There are people there. There are some crazy mixed-up kids who call themselves socialists. They're not socialists in the least. If they had any historical understanding, they would give themselves the correct name, which would also be the politically winning, successful name. That would be New Deal Democrats. Not socialists. Socialism would be something like this. It is the confiscation, the nationalization of the means of production. And, of course, the average modern activist would say, what's production? What is production? Well, take something like Apple. I suppose that would be production. It's kind of a stretch, but that's production. Right? Production simply means the creation of the things of survival, right? Food, clothing, housing, scientific research, medical, exploration, astronomy, all this other stuff. Everything that a civilization needs, but in a tangible, physical way, right? The tangible, physical wealth and actual commodity production. Savings and loan are not an industry. Hollywood is not an industry. Industry is steel. It is pharmaceuticals, certainly, and so on down the line. But if you came out and said, nationalize Apple, that would be socialism. Or nationalize Google. It's even more of a stretch, right? Because here nothing is really being produced, or very little. But that's socialism, is you want to nationalize all this stuff. Now, the general account is that in the United States, you don't need to do all that. It's not the best way to do it. What you need is a thoroughly regulated atmosphere where the government is providing stern regulation with bright line prohibitions and early retribution. In other words, exactly what you don't have for the, say, by the Federal Reserve to the New York banking community. Anything but. And that's supposed to be a government agency, although it's really a private agency, right? The New York Federal Reserve Bank, completely private agency, privately owned, privately controlled. But it's a regulator for banks. This part does not work. So anyway, the New Deal model is regulation, and that's probably better than government ownership. Although there's no taboo on government ownership. To have a state sector is perfectly okay. But to come out and say, I'm a democratic socialist. You're buying into something. They're buying into something they don't even know. Democratic Socialists were the Socialist Party of the USA. It came down to a guy called Norman Thomas. Look him up, Norman Thomas. He was known as the State Department Socialist. And what it meant was a political faction with a certain amount of left cover, because they said they were socialists, or social democrats. That's a little bit further to the right. And it was useful during the Cold War. And the U.S. foreign policy in the Cold War had a very important component of the Second International, the Socialist International. And, this is no glorious tradition. The glorious tradition, the winning tradition in the United States is the New Deal. Franklin D. Roosevelt, his prestige is enormous, right? One of the very small group of greatest presidents ever. Why throw that all overboard and come out with this tired, wretched, democratic socialist stuff? And again, the democratic is from the Cold War to say, well, those commies are one thing. They call themselves socialists. Then it's going to have to be solved some other way, right? But we say, do this as New Deal. Forget about democratic socialists. This would be my word to Ocasio and others in the current Congress. Anyway, all of this is going on, and the Democrats need to find a direction. So let's look at it now. Trump says he's willing to let the government shutdown go on for 1 year, a year, or many months. Now, we had these two events, right? The Democratic leaders in the driveway, and then we had Trump with a Rose Garden event. A Rose Garden event, even though it's kind of wintry here, it's overcast. I don't think there was any rain, but there might well have been. So Trump came out there and talked and said, yes, it's true. I told them that I'd be perfectly happy to shut down the government, 1/4 of it, for 1 year. Now, again, the Republican Party should no longer exist based on that alone. So we had these two numbers that were done on the White House stage. The driveway event with the Democratic leadership, the Pelosi, Steny, Chuck, and Durbin. Now, Pelosi says this was contentious. We made no progress. Nothing to report. These idiotic journalists saying, oh, did you make any progress? Pelosi, I thought, was right to ask, what do you mean by progress? What do you mean? That we make concessions to Trump? Is that what you want, you journalists? I guess when you believe in nothing, the idea of splitting the difference is just about automatic. Anyway, this gave a very grim appraisal of the events that had been going on, right? This meeting with Trump. Schumer, I think, from Schumer's remarks, we get the idea that the Democratic position has changed somewhat. It's actually simpler now. It simply says the House Democrats have passed these bills. There's one bill for the 1/4 of the government that shut down minus Department of Homeland Security. There's one bill that says 1/4 minus DHS should be funded all the way to September 30th. And the other one is that the DHS will be funded for 30 days. So the Democrats did that. Trump has said, no, I'm not going to approve that. And then, of course, his bootlicker, Mitch McConnell, who I believe is going to have to run for re-election in not too long, bootlicker Mitch said, well, I'll never bring this to the floor. I won't let it pass. I won't let it pass unless I know in advance that Trump will approve it. That's not how it works. You pass it, and you send it down to the White House, And if he wants to veto it, he can. But he, in doing that, you're putting pressure on him. You're saying, this is what the Congress thinks. What do you think? Do you think anything? There's also, we should never forget that possibility under the U.S. system that a bill which has been sent to the president can become law without his signature. He doesn't have to sign it. After 10 days, if he doesn't send it back, if he doesn't veto it and send it back, then it becomes law without his signature, right? And that's the trick. If that happens at the end of the session, that's where this issue of the pocket veto comes into play. But Trump could let that go through, just saying, well, I'm not going to interfere, right? I'll let the Congress work its will. Anyhow, that was a grim evaluation. And Chuck is basically saying, Schumer, open the government and we will negotiate. Open the government and we will negotiate. Don't hold the United States government hostage. And then he tells this story designed to appeal to Trump. I was in upstate New York. I heard from one of my constituents in upstate New York. This was a lady she was trying to get an FHA, Federal Housing Administration mortgage that needed to be approved. And as we mentioned the other day, right now the approval of mortgages is blocked. So this constituent in upstate New York. Now, upstate New York, once again, is not the ultra-left area of New York City. It's where the Republicans, at least some Republicans, may live. So close the place for months, or for a year. Again, Democratic line, reopen the government, then negotiate. Of course, Trump can't say, yeah, but then I can't extort. I'm holding the whole thing hostage. Later on in the day, out come Trump and a strange entourage of people. He has Pence with him. I'm thinking of Pence as the man without qualities, the famous novel by Robert Musil, Der Mann ohne Eigenschaften, the man without qualities, an absolute cipher, an absolute zero. This is a guy who I guess he was really a radio announcer. Wasn't that what he was? Because he certainly doesn't show any signs of mental life. Anyway, he's just a voice. He's a voice that speaks. So he was there. He got to say a few words. Brunhilde was there. Brunhilde, I want to say Birgit Nielsen. No, Secretary Nielsen of Department of Homeland Security. And the two House Republican honchos now, Kevin McCarthy and his sidekick Scalise, right? The veteran of the battle of that baseball diamond. But notice, with that crew, there's no Mitch McConnell. There's nobody from the great dominant Republican side in the Senate. This indicates growing tension, my friends, growing tension. No Mitch. You think Mitch wants to get up there and say, the public be damned, we're going to keep the government shut down for a year? And all those workers, practically 1 million workers and families, and let them be damned? Well, you see. So, and now this the larger problem. We've had two enraged psychotic monologues this week. We had one in the cabinet room. This was funny. Here we have Don sitting in the midst of these cabinet secretaries. The cabinet secretaries, they're not real ones. They're only acting ones, right? They're actually lobbyists. They're lobbyists acting, masquerading as cabinet secretaries. So there's Trump sitting there. He doesn't have any women left. The women are all gone. But he's got acting secretaries. He's got an acting secretary of the Interior, an acting secretary of Defense, an acting attorney general. That's the infamous Whitaker. He's got an acting director of EPA, and it's not really the same thing because, it's not a question of Senate confirmation, but you've also got Mick Mulvaney, right? Mick the Knife, austerity ghoul built into his name. Mick the Knife is there as acting chief of staff. So this was the enraged, psychotic monologue in which Trump said, I fired Mattis, McChrystal was fired like a dog. Anyway, there's not enough time to even tick off the various crazy statements. But that was the first one. And then the second one was what happened today. And for all I know, this is still going on. Right? I can't stay there and watch all of it. So this was Trump talking today. It was rage fit against the Ninth Federal Circuit Court of Appeals, but especially the federal district judges within there, that when one of them found against the Republicans on the DACA issue, they wanted to deport all those DACA recipients. This, says Trump, this is what killed any deal about DACA. Now, this is a funny subtext, right? DACA, it's an important issue. Those people have to stay. That's a key part of your workforce for tomorrow. Why do you want to alienate them, right? Those are allies. This is sure as anybody else. There was an attempt by the Trump people to somehow signal that they were willing to include DACA in a deal. Steny Hoyer, speaking behind, with no TV cameras to print journalists, Steny Hoyer gave a press conference or press availability where he said DACA was not even mentioned this morning, right, when they went to see Trump. DACA never even arose. So watch out for the fakery by Don McCahon. Yo, this is Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. So this latest escapade by Trump seems now to include a pattern, right? They used to make fun of Fidel Castro because of his speeches, which would go on for 3 or 4 hours with ranting and posturing and mimicry, histrionics, whatever you want. Trump is now doing this, and he does it with these pained individuals who are standing there as props. He actually did it. I couldn't even keep up with it. Yesterday, he came to the press room. Maybe we're dealing with 3 cases, not just 2. He came to the press room with some people he claimed were from the Border Patrol or similar kinds of officials, and they were telling how you really need a wall. Remember, you must always leave the wall. Remember that classic off-Broadway show of the early 60s, The Fantastics. And in there we have such lines as, remember, you must always leave the wall. That was The Fantastics. Well, now we have The Fantastics of Trump. So he's doing this now more or less every day, I guess Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, and he's raving. How long does this go on? I guess we don't know. Today he offered his views about impeachment. He said, how can you impeach somebody who's doing such a great job? I'm doing the greatest job ever. This is the best presidential record in the history of the United States. There's no collusion, and everything is going well. Now, we have to, the occasion for this is Rashida Tlaib, Congresswoman from Michigan. And her line was, we're going to impeach that blankety blank. Look it up. It's worth seeing. And that was Thursday. That was yesterday. And so this was a hard-hitting comment. And we find no fault in her. We think that this is fine. I'd rather hear we're going to impeach him than this garbage we're hearing about bipartisanship and idiocy about PAYGO. We don't want PAYGO. PAYGO is a straitjacket. PAYGO ties your hands. You can't spend for social needs But if the Republicans want to have tax cuts for the rich, that has no pay-go. No pay-go for that. So it's all in one direction, and we don't want it. And Pelosi instituted pay-go when she got in 2007. She was out within 4 years. This was part of it, her stupid pay-go. So Rashida Tlaib, I think, we admire her spirit, right? Maybe not her vocabulary, but we certainly admire her fighting spirit. And if we had a couple of hundred like that, things might look different. So Trump is simply raving. He's got all these things to say about the Ninth Circuit and DACA. We went through it. He has theories about terrorists, smugglers, about how now the big threat is no longer poor people on foot, but it's now driving through the desert and somehow always turning left. Couldn't figure that one out. Anyway, I think we're witnessing some kind of mental disintegration. He was confronted with the idea that you are failing with the wall. You promised a wall paid for by Mexico. It's not paid for by Mexico. And Trump is now saying that a steel wall with slats, because you can see through it, is better than the stone or masonry or concrete wall. Anyway, this all crazy. Now, we would therefore hope that the Democrats would have a clear view. The Democrats, however, are beginning to make, I think, a pretty obvious mistake. And we're going to compare what they may be doing now, what they may be beginning to do now, compare that to the tragic mistakes that the Democrats made in 1974 through 76. In other words, how did we get from the Republican Party at a low ebb through Watergate, right, through the departure of Nixon and the ouster of Agnew, too, because it was both of them. Agnew first, then Nixon. 74, 76, and then 80. So within a period of 6 years, we go from the Republican Party on the ropes to the beginning of this monstrous generation of reactionary Republican control, right? Reagan, Bush. How did that happen? What's the explanation? And then there's the other one, especially relevant for Pelosi. From 2007 to 2011, we had the Democratic control of the House of Representatives. How did that go wrong? The usual explanation is, that's because those voters are racist and they didn't like Obama, and it's all a racist backlash against Obama. I'm sorry, that's much too easy. And you can see that there's already been an effort in the last couple of years to say anybody who voted for Trump was exclusively motivated by the fact that they were racists, and they didn't have any valid economic complaint. They didn't have any legitimate beef. It was all racism. And I think that is a fatal mistake. How can you say that economics, jobs, opportunity, upward mobility, these blue-collar workers in the Rust Belt, they have economic interests just like everybody else, except they respond in a different way. They go right. When you might go left, they go right. So that's important. Now, here's what we recommend. Let's do the positive side first. Our word to the Democrats is do not make the first item. It may already be too late. They may be already doing this afternoon. But they have a package about process reforms, essentially, right? They have reforms about voting rights. And let me hasten to say, these are things you want to do. You want to pass these in the first month, in the first 6 weeks. Yeah, for sure. Pass them. But remember, that election is not for a while. You have a little bit of time to work with, whereas the thing you're going to try to do is to get the attention of all working people, all of them, doesn't matter what identity group. Working people are their own identity group. That would be our own way to put it, if you must. Get the attention and the sympathy, the support of working people by coming up with a $15 federal minimum wage. That's important. Now, I'm sure Pelosi has all sorts of reasons why not. That her husband, the financier Paul Pelosi, said, no, don't do that. You're going to turn the legions of greed against you, and on and on. But this would be exactly it. A $15 minimum wage, put that floor under everybody, move up all the pay scales, and win at least some grudging sympathy or acknowledgement from these Trump blue-collar workers, right? The Rust Bowl, right? Make further inroads into that group. You've got to, if you want to get Trump out, guaranteed out in 2020, you've got to turn the blue-collar workers against him. And how do you do that is you pass a minimum wage and let him veto it. And then they'll see. Maybe they'll get the idea then. And the other one is Whitaker. How can you have this Whitaker? They were posturing. The Democrats were doing all this stuff about how Whitaker has not been confirmed by the Senate. He certainly has not. He's not qualified. He's suspicious. He's sleazebag. Yes, all of that. So now impeach him. You have the House. Put it up. Impeach him. You'll probably have to. It would have been that great. To the second hour of World Crisis Radio. This is your host, Webster Tarpley, Ph.D., here in Washington, D.C. Now, in order to get a complete picture of this government shutdown, we should remember that Pelosi has taken two important positions. We hope that these are maintained. First of all, nothing for the wall, no increased cash for the wall. Trump claims that he's going to get $5.6 billion. This is unlikely. A few hundred million, maybe as a shuck, as a sop to him and his demented followers, but not anything more than that. And then she says that the indictment of the incumbent president cannot be ruled out. In other words, I think she says it's an open discussion, an open question. Now, Pelosi is no bargain, clearly, but compared to 2007, she's doing a little bit better. So let's count our blessings in that regard. And remember, the important consideration is to speed the Republican Party into that same trash heap of history, otherwise inhabited by the Federalists, the Whigs, the Know-Nothings, and so on down the line. Right? They need to disappear because they are a threat to the life and health of many people and the future of the country. National defense, party of chaos, party of treason. They are certainly all of that. Now, we should take a look at the economics. Now, today we had one of those classic bear market rallies. We've gone through this on the Daily Show, which I urge you all to follow. We did a whole unit on bear market rallies. You saw this 6 or 7 times between October 1929 and the absolute lows in 32 to 33, right? They would always fall and then plateau and then fall again. And remember that every time it plateaued, they said, well, prosperity is just around the corner. And in terms of the big point pops, it's interesting to see that this terrible time of October, November, December 2008 is when you have some of the biggest point pops, like today, right? Today, Dow Jones Industrial Average up 750, S&P up 84, NASDAQ up 4.26%. So it's between 3 and 3.5 for the Dow and the S&P, and 4.25 for the NASDAQ, which had gotten beat up. Russell 2000 up almost 4. Unfortunately, these are simply that. They are the result of short covering. They're the result of the plunge protection team building on that favorable atmosphere of the short covering. And therefore, this means, I think, very little. Rather, what we have from this week, I think, is something much more serious. This is not a stock market event, right? As we started to tell you back in October, you could see that the stock market was about to take a dive, and we were, first of all, intent on covering that because it would be a way to hurt the political cause of Trump, to expose him as this failure and blowhard that, of course, he is. And today was no exception. Trump came out there and he said, it was supposed to be about the government shutdown, right? Oh, but no. He said, I've got to tell you about this wonderful job report. Let's just be precise about what those are, right? The job growth, 312,000. That's certainly 100,000 more than average. I'm wondering if that leaves him still behind Obama. In other words, the first X months of Trump, how does that compare with the last X months of Obama? And up to now, it has been that Trump has been behind. And however, at the same time, monthly job growth 312,000. Unemployment now 3.9%. Unemployment ticked up. Despite this, right? Various reasons. Oh, and we're told that average hourly pay over the last 12 months has gone up by 3.2%. Yes, dear friends, but inflation, unfortunately, has been about 2.4%. So what you've got now is the beauty of 0.8%, less than 1% raise, in effect, per year. That is pretty wretched. And, of course, I always have to remind people, those photographers at the Interior Department have now learned the painful lesson that if you're dealing with Mad Dog Don, you better make sure that crowd looks huge. You got to make sure that crowd looks bigger than Obama. So they've learned that, right? They have doctored, massaged, and otherwise cooked their photographic records. I'm always wondering whether the people at the Bureau of Labor Statistics have also gotten some letters like this. We do know that guy, the guy who was involved in the sweetheart settlement for Epstein in the trafficking case is now the Secretary of Labor. So maybe he has gotten the word that if you want to have Trump go out and really fight for you, he's now under some pressure for this. I'm sure the Democrats are going to call him in saying, what was this, right? You were the U.S. attorney and you made this sweetheart deal with Epstein. We'll have to watch that. So this is the big news. The things that have pushed up the stock market today are, once again, short covering, plunge protection team, clearly, mobilized by Mnuchin, can't be denied, done in public, and then two events, right? One is the job report we've just gone through, and the other is Jerome Powell of the Federal Reserve saying that he would be, he's going to go easy on the interest rate increases. Interest rate increases are not going to be so abrupt. They're not going to be so brusque. So those two things drove the stock jobbers into a world of euphoria, and that is now coming to an end. So, this is going to be interesting. But I think anybody staying long in some of those stocks is crazy. Anyway, the point though here is the world economic contraction. We have been following this, right? The news comes out. It's not very dramatic. These are statistics, right? Germany, the last quarter is a contraction. Japan is a contraction. In terms of industry, we had reports now in the last couple of days that Italy and Sweden are in a contraction, that South Korea is in a contraction, that Malaysia is in a contraction, and, of course, China. Now, China, they put out statistics that are widely viewed with extreme skepticism and with good reason. Cooking, massaging, otherwise doctoring is the order of the day. But now we have Apple with their supposedly, generally accepted accounting practices, whatever. And Apple says that their sales of iPhones in China, that is declining. So this is thought to be a kind of a view, a window into the economic situation in China. Now, there are other U.S. corporations have said that their sales in China are going down. FedEx, Starbucks, Tiffany, the upscale, Daimler-Benz, Mercedes-Benz, all of those say that their sales in China are going down. So it looks pretty much like China is going down. And that means a lot for the stock droppers today. It puts you back in. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Toffee here in Washington, D.C. It's the afternoon of Friday, January 4th. So the contraction. The contraction is, I think, beyond question. It is a world economic slowdown. We've had the ISM, the Purchasing Managers Report here in the U.S. in the last couple of days. It points to contraction. There had been a similar version in China a couple of days before, pointing to contraction. Contraction means depression, in other words, or if it goes far enough, it becomes synonymous with depression. Notice that Apple already by itself, because of the large number of components, ingredients that go into these iPhones, it is thought to be a bellwether for contraction. In other words, that stock has lost $450 billion. You may remember. It reached $1 trillion during the summer, late summer. And I said, don't be fooled, it's not worth $1 trillion. And sure enough, now it's down about $450 billion. So I guess it wasn't worth $1 trillion, was it? Too bad if you bought it at those inflated levels. But it is, once again, because of the many components that go into this, it becomes a bellwether for contraction. So we've had all manner of reports, series, I think I've mentioned most of them, that point to the world economy slowing. Certainly the oil price being down. Trump bragged about that today. He said, "Oh yeah, I brought you that. I saved you all that money on oil and gas." Well, yeah, that's fine as far as it goes, but if it at the cost of a depression, it's probably not the best outcome. So that's the economic situation. Now, whatever Trump does, he's not going to escape the fact of this contraction. Some of the commentators on CNBC were saying, well, we can have decoupling, we can have the stock market crashing, but our normal economy, the real economy, will be doing fine. Sorry, boys, you cannot do this. And nobody knows this better than Trump, right? Most of these people come on and say, well, the crash of 1987 had no effect on anything. Baloney. It had a tremendous effect on real estate markets in New York and elsewhere. That's when Trump began to go bankrupt. It was in the early 1990s, and those were the somewhat slowly emerging results of that crash, right? The stock market turbulence of October 1987, right? The end of the Reagan bubble. Now let's switch over to a couple of issues on politics and indeed economics, but also strategy. we have this interesting thing. One of the things that Trump raved about on Wednesday, as I recall, was he said the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in December 1979 because terrorists were pouring into the Soviet Union from Afghanistan, and therefore this was something they had every right to do. It was basically a good thing. Now, again, this is not so much a historical debate. It's what does this mean in the here and now? This is an exercise for the U.S. government. That's an exercise in revisionism. We are, of course, acutely aware that Zbigniew Brzezinski boasted that he had lured, goaded, gotten the Soviets into Afghanistan as their Vietnam, that he did this by messing with the forms of government in Afghanistan, and that he was therefore taking credit for the collapse of the Soviet Union, which is apparently what Trump believes too, right? That they went in as the Soviet Union and they came out as Russia. They lost all of those territories and so forth. Well, again, in terms of causality, this makes it too simple. But the idea is, what does it mean when he says that? And we, of course, called attention to this several days ago. If you look at our program that was done Thursday, right? Thursday, January 3rd, in the headline, you can read, Trump's praise of Soviets in Afghanistan will be read in Moscow by Putin as an invitation to invade smaller neighbors. Yeah, certainly. If that was good, if that was well done, if Trump thinks that's the way things ought to be done, well, it's not in a vacuum. Right? We know that Russian forces are massing on the borders of Ukraine. Now, this is a complex issue, right? Because we are not fans of the government in Kiev. But this stuff, I would recommend, for the sake of everybody, leave the status quo. Leave it. Don't mess with the status quo there any further. You're going to try to do that, there's going to be a lot of trouble, because that is an area of tremendous geopolitical sensitivity. So with the case of the Ukraine, the Russians are massing troops on the border of Ukraine. They have also interfered with this Ukrainian tug and some small warships in the Straits of Kerch. That's the Sea of Azov. And that the Ukraine is supposed to have unfettered access to that. All they need to do, I believe, is to inform in advance that they're coming. There are these other places, though, right? Georgia. And again, Saakashvili is long gone. It's a country sitting there, right, with a frozen conflict. We can look a little bit further to Estonia, right? If there should be an attempt by Putin to attack, to overwhelm these countries, this will be an extreme danger. The way that appeasement works, after all, is that it encourages the aggressor. Appeasement is like blackmail, right? If somebody comes and says, if you give me $1 million, I won't reveal these terrible secrets I know about you. Well, yeah, okay, give $1 million, but then you know for sure when that money runs out, the blackmailer is going to be back demanding more. Say, now I want $5 million. And eventually it leads then towards violence. So certainly in this case also, you cannot expect to have Russian armies or these green men or other kinds of irregular forces or anything of the sort. This is now a very dangerous game because, and you can see it, like what happened in Eastern Europe, right? From the Nazi takeover of Prague, Bohemia, into the war with Poland. We'll get to it in a minute, but you can see that appeasement encourages adventurism, which then leads to a backlash. And the backlash catches the aggressor perhaps unaware, and then you have war. Back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Once again, join us Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. Go to americansystem.tv, americansystem.tv. Join the podcast. You want to be a part of this. This is now the classic time to be a part of this effort. So the point is, Trump, in our view, is signaling that there will be no resistance in the case of Russian invasion of smaller. Ukraine is not small, but these countries, right? Probably non-NATO members, therefore Ukraine, Georgia, but maybe he judges that Trump's depravity, his proclivity to betray his oath of office, that all of this is so extreme that even NATO members, the Baltic states and so forth, that these places could be overrun. It's extremely dangerous because what you could see is with somebody as unstable as Trump, he can say, okay, yeah, I'm going to ignore this, but then a backlash of public opinion, a backlash in the Senate can then lead to, to a rapid change. In other words, first of all, blank check appeasement, come on in. Then, wait a minute, this is a public relations crisis for me. I've got to do something, therefore strike back. And that's sort of the way this stuff works. So therefore, we are in, once again, grave danger as long as those launch codes and as long as these other decisions are in the hands of Trump. Now, we just had this interview with Elizabeth Warren this week. Now, we're broadly sympathetic to Elizabeth Warren in terms of being someone who at least talks a good game against Wall Street and the bankers. She has some important points. However, there are probably two limitations that we ought to point to. First of all, Elizabeth Warren really does not understand economics, and by that I mean American system economics, right? That austerity is always bad, always to be ruled out, and that what you need is a growth of living standards, longevity, that you need more capital intensity, energy intensity, and indeed that Malthusianism as a form of austerity is absolutely unacceptable. So Elizabeth Warren's doctrine on economics is the system is corrupt, the system is wallowing in corruption, and therefore you should clean it up. It harkens back to Pelosi. Pelosi earlier in the week is saying we need clean government. Well, Elizabeth Warren is saying we need clean economics. And yeah, sure, it's better to have a Consumer Finance Protection Bureau, but no matter how good your Consumer Finance Protection Bureau is, and we would like to make it good, right? Kick out Mulvaney, of course, and restore it and jazz it up, right? Make it more powerful. That will not give you an economic recovery. That will not increase investment in capital goods. And again, I'm afraid Elizabeth Warren might say, what are capital goods, or what is production? This is her weakness. So the notion that corruption by itself, the most primitive form of this is people say, well, the reason that people are poor is because people in Wall Street steal all the benefits and they consume them. It's worse. The people in Wall Street make sure that whatever social surplus we have is misinvested. If you had a certain amount of capital, say $1 billion worth of capital, what are those Wall Street guys going to do? They're not going to invest that in plant and equipment and jobs, production of any kind. No, they're not. They're going to go buy derivatives. And that's where you get into this thing. If she would include, for example, the banning of derivatives, at least the banning of collateralized debt obligations and credit default swaps, she'd be okay. The other, or that would be a step in the right direction at least, right? But as long as it's just corruption, I'm afraid it's not going to work. You won't get an economic recovery. You'll get amelioration, yeah. But why not go for something that's actually viable in terms of making this stuff work? The other thing is, and this is a real weakness. She thinks that Trump is right to pull that small peacekeeping force of the U.S. out of Syria. She thinks that's right. In other words, on the economics, Elizabeth Warren is something of a mushhead, although obviously far better than the Trump gang, by all means. This would be a step forward. But this is the season where you can say things the way they are, right? We don't have to, pull the punches because we don't want to hurt a candidate that is, the only hope of getting away from something worse, right? This lesser evil stuff. But Elizabeth Warren, with this whole corruption stuff, this is not going to do it. But the other main thing is, and this is going to be a problem for the whole Democratic Party, they are stuck with the Vietnam global war on terror post 9/11 approach to these things. In other words, it's funny, strange, because the United States has been under Russian attack for some years now, right? Trump, the greatest attack, right? The most successful attack, putting an enemy sympathizer, at least, into the White House, right? Putting somebody in there. According to Meacham, he has fulfilled the predicates of treason. Many have said this. So that's an unfriendly act. That's an attack on the United States. Have you realized, therefore, that Russia is an adversary, that they're dangerous? I would hope so. But with Elizabeth Warren, she separates the world of what Russia is doing, the superpower realm, superpower rivalry, right? And she retreats into this anti-war stuff. The anti-war stuff from the 80s, the 90s, the aughties, this is not the world you live in now, right? You're looking at Russia. You're looking at China. They're armed and dangerous. Here, the Chinese have got a space probe landing on the far side of the moon. Well, that same probe can deliver H-bombs onto your house. Ever figure that out? It's not just science, right? This is military, and I'm sure it is for them too. There ought to be a Sputnik response. So far, we're not seeing it, but maybe it can be ginned up. I would hope so. That you have to do something about this. But when Warren talks about Afghanistan, she's talking about whether the Taliban do this and Al-Qaeda does this and whether you're pacifying these areas or not and so forth. That's not the point. The point is those 2,000 or 3,000 U.S. soldiers, or in this case Syria, same difference, they are a peacekeeping force designed to prevent these places from being gobbled up by Russia and or China. Remember, take a look at the map of Afghanistan. There's that long appendage that goes off to the right. It's called the Walk-On Corridor. And if you look really carefully, you will see that Afghanistan shares a border with China. Do you want China to take over Afghanistan? Afghanistan is sort of the hub of the entire Eurasian landmass, right? If you want to go from India to Europe, it's likely that you're going to be going through or near Afghanistan. So, Elizabeth Warren is strategically unfit for the White House at the present time, right? Maybe she'll realize it better. So, corruption and this naive anti-war stuff, I'm sorry, this will not cut the mustard. Back in a minute. Crisis Radio. So let me try to sum up that thing with Elizabeth Warren. Elizabeth Warren basically sees the Russian attack on the U.S. political system, I gather, as a domestic U.S. event. And she doesn't say, well, if Russia is that hostile in terms of imposing this fascist here in the White House, then they're going to be hostile across the board, right? They're going to be hostile. But she doesn't see it that way. Afghanistan is different. With Afghanistan, everything shifts back into the old think of the arguments that were made for Afghanistan in 2001. And those were bankrupt arguments. But now it's different. You're not there for the purpose of doing anything vis-a-vis the Taliban or Al-Qaeda or ISIS or any of this stuff. That's irrelevant. What you don't want is Russia and or China coming in and taking over. Now let's just look at this. The Republicans have been throwing around this term perpetual war. Well, it goes back to a saying of Charles Beard, the American historian, who had some positive things. But here's the big problem. World War I, World War II. And for our purposes, you can compare that. World War I, compare that to Vietnam and the War on Terror. So during World War I, it was clear the U.S. had no business interfering in World War I. The U.S. intervention into World War I made things worse. If the U.S. had said, okay, you Europeans, we're staying out in the spring of 1917, right, instead of declaring war like Woodrow Wilson did, we're staying out in 1917, we're anti-war. This was the correct thing, because the World War I was not worth fighting. And by virtue of the U.S. coming in, it added 2 years. If the U.S. had been unwilling to come in any way, the British and the French would have to say, okay, let's have a negotiated peace. By definition, that would not have been the draconian Carthaginian Treaty of Versailles. So you might have shortened World War I by 2 years, 1917 and 1918. That would mean no Russian Revolution, no communism, probably no fascism, because it would have meant a 2-year war, right? 14, 15, and 16 at most. 2.5 years, instead of this full-fledged thing that we had. So, essentially, World War I, the proper attitude was to be against it. Sure, be at least momentarily, a pacifist. But remember, there's always this question, right? It's often said about the French armies, that the French armies are always, they're ready to fight the last war, the previous war. For example, in 1870, the French armies were somewhat defensive in their orientation, and they lost the war. Certainly the French armies of 1914 decided that the defensive was no good. You had to be on the offensive. You didn't want forts. You wanted to be out there in the countryside with a 75 millimeter gun, and maneuvering and so forth, but no forts. So all attack, everything attack. Victory is a question of moral superiority and so forth. So in effect, in 1914, when in the real world defensive warfare was going to be better, right? Fortifications to protect you against artillery, against machine guns, so you don't have to go out and get caught in the barbed wire. The French mentality, the extreme attack, right? Attack à outrance of 1914. This is out of phase, and therefore then in 1940, when the Germans are attacking, the Germans are now doing this, blitzkrieg, and it's very mobile, and it's not defensive, and the French have learned the lesson of 1914, but they've prolonged it into the 1940s. The Maginot Line is precisely the forts they should have had in 1914, but didn't. So they're always trying to catch up with the last war, but not succeeding. So that is sort of what we have. Here in the United States, there were a bunch of people who were against Woodrow Wilson. It's correct position, be against him. They were against the Palmer raids, these oppressive police state measures under Mitchell Palmer, the Attorney General. And they decided they hated war. And in World War I, that's correct. The problem with that is, though, that verity, that correct conclusion for 1914 to 1920 or so, That's no longer true in the late 1930s. In other words, the world changes. Panta rei, everything's in flux. Heraclitus was right. You don't step into the same river twice. So you can't just sit there and say, oh, well, I learned my lesson. I'm against the war. I'm anti-war. Yeah, being anti-war in 1938 or 39 makes you, objectively, a stooge for Hitler. And there are a lot of people who they shipwrecked on this problem. For example, this Harry Elmer Barnes, right? He's infamous today as an anti-Semite and somebody with some kind of Nazi sympathies, or at least doesn't want to defend. Remember that Hitler's foreign policy was to say, we can fight everybody, but we can't fight them all at once. So we're going to try to do them one at a time. And therefore, the only thing they asked at the beginning from people in the United States was just stay out of it for a while until we're ready for you. Your turn will come. This is how some historians have looked at this whole thing. So you were against the war on terror after 9/11. Yeah, I was, sure. And that was the right thing then. But now, and this applies to Syria, Afghanistan, and elsewhere, it's no longer 2001. It's no longer 2011. It's none of this. Now you're in the world of the U.S. against the Sino-Soviet bloc, against the Russia-China combine. And now you really have to choose. And if you say, well, like Elizabeth Warren says, well, you know, we haven't been able to defeat the Taliban. We haven't been able to defeat Al-Qaeda. There's ISIS. This is irrelevant. What you've got there, and above all, in Syria, it's even clearer, right? 2,000 or 3,000 troops that it allows you to prevent the entire country from it becoming essentially a Soviet satellite. And I would also suggest, if you really want to know, you think Assad is maybe not so displeased by having the U.S. there? You think Assad wants to be left alone with the Russians so that he is absolutely at their beck and call? Or wouldn't he like to be able to play the Russians a tiny bit against the U.S., right? The classic stance of a third world dictator in the Cold War, right? Play one against the other. So you have to look at this, and people, they have a very hard time changing. And of course, these people like Harry Elmer Barnes. We also have Sidney Fay wrote about. These are the people who criticized correctly the process of joining into World War I. But the problem was they painted themselves into a corner, and out of that comes the attack on Roosevelt, right? And the attack on Roosevelt was from Beard, Harry Elmer Barnes, perpetual war for perpetual peace. Well, there's everything wrong with this. First of all, it simply is that you guys formed your attitude in the World War I era, and that's all over. Now we're in the World War II era, and your views are obsolete. There are a lot of people who are similarly obsolete today. So, plus, what are you going to do if there's an aggressor out there in the world? You know, the enemy always gets a voice. The enemy always gets a vote. So don't think that you can solve everything on your own initiative, because there are other forces in the world that, frankly, you do not control. So we will be with you again next week.